Hello, everyone. My name is William Steinley, and I'm working on my Master's of Science in Forestry at Stephen F. Austin State University. The research we've been conducting over the past 2 years covers the changes in plant communities over time in the context of changing fire frequencies in the Piney Woods. Let's begin with some background on fire history and the historical burn regime in East Texas. The first evidence of some form of naturally occurring fire was found in charcoal deposits of fossilized plants living nearly 500 million years ago. Fast forward a few million years, and it's discovered that charcoal sedimentation is present in marine beds once exposed to the surface. The evidence of recurring fires can also be seen in fire scars found in trees dating back hundreds of years. In addition to this, nearly all lineages of terrestrial plants found in fire-prone ecosystems show resprouting behavior following fire. This taxonomical characteristic can be found in both angiosperms and gymnosperms, and in exceptionally old species such as Ginkgo biloba and Ephedra. The development of morphological plant characteristics such as bark thickness can also be attributed directly to the prevalence of fires. This combination of evidence leads us to believe that these systems have been impacted by fire long before the rise of even the earliest human ancestors. And once our ancestors did rise to dominance across the globe, their use of fire to manipulate their surroundings led to accelerated fire adaptations in many plant communities. The applications of controlled or prescribed fire in conjunction with naturally occurring conflagrations have developed ecosystems over time into fire-adapted or fire-dependent species compositions. Let's move on to some more recent history. Prior to the 20th century, government involvement in fire management was extremely limited, if not entirely absent. Prescribed burning was common to remove logging debris before the reestablishment of crop trees, primarily loblolly pine in the southeastern United States. However, during the early 20th century, a combination of more deadly wildfires and high-level politics led to a period of fire exclusion practices and propaganda, which have caused a myriad of changes to natural systems across the nation. The change we are primarily focused on here is within southeast upland pine communities. These southern pine communities contain multiple federally listed species under either threatened or endangered classification. Fires played a significant role in establishing and maintaining these communities. Frequent low-intensity fires would suppress the development of understory woody vegetation, creating what was described as open and park-like pine savannas, which provide habitat for a diverse range of plants and animals. The removal of fire from these systems led to a lower herbaceous diversity, increased fuel loads, and slower nutrient cycling. The primary concern has been to public safety. This is the increased fuel loads may lead to increased fire danger. Ecologically, however, the change in disturbance regime has led to reductions in species diversity across these systems. The reduction of herbaceous species diversity lowers the fine fuel density and hinders the rate of spread across the landscape, which further disrupts the disturbance regime, leading to an accelerated loss of habitat. Let's talk specifically about disturbance regimes. A disturbance regime can be described as the cumulative and repetitive effects of disturbance over time and space. The development of a fire disturbance regime results from the cumulative interaction of fire, vegetation, climate, humans, and topography. A primary concept of this relationship is that the effect of a previous fire will determine future fire behavior through its influence on stand characteristics. This happens in fragments across the landscape, forming a mosaic of stands experiencing different successional states. The effects of fire are almost synonymous with intensity. Because this variable is so important to the structure of fire-prone ecosystems, it's important to know what determines the intensity of fires within a system. Conditions such as fuel type, loading structure, and continuity, as well as climatic variables, determine the intensity of fire events. If a change in mortality, that is more or less mortality than is typical, is significant or continuous, the plant community composition will shift towards species that favor that type of regime. For example, in upland pine communities, the primary fuel loads are from pine litter. The heavy fuel loads and the concomitant presence of pyrogenic grasses allow the fire to spread rapidly and consistently across the landscape, which reduces encroachment of woody species such as oaks and hickories. The high continuity of fuels facilitates the spread of fires into adjacent mixed pine hardwood communities, and over time, these conditions favor the more flammable, shade-intolerant pines. The high frequency of fires fueled by this heterogeneous pine litter layer leads to a spatial pyrodiversity of fire-adapted species that in turn influence future fire behavior for their benefit. This interaction between fire and plant communities is the primary ecological driver in upland pine burn regimes. The overarching goal of this research is to collect, analyze, and compare the effect that fire has on understory plant composition in eastern Texas. Some objectives are to determine the impact of changing fire frequencies in upland pine communities by quantifying the vegetation and stand characteristics at sites with different fire return intervals. The first site location, Winston 8 Ranch, is composed of 3,400 acres of longleaf pine habitat, rangelands, and wetlands. The second site is the Roy E. Larson Sandyland Sanctuary, located about 30 minutes north of Beaumont, Texas. It's owned and operated by the Nature Conservancy, with the primary objective being longleaf pine restoration. Sanctuary protects about 5,600 acres of longleaf pine savanna. It's managed heavily with prescribed fire and mechanical thinning. The three national forests, the Sabine, Angelina, and the Davy Crockett, each contain multiple plots that have been resampled periodically through the past few years. The predominant overstory is loblolly shortleaf mix on the Davy Crockett and loblolly longleaf on the Angelina Sabine. The last location we have is the Upland Island Wilderness area. This area has had a very low fire frequency over the past few decades, and no timber management has occurred since the wilderness designation in 1984. Moving on to plot design. This plot design and methodology was established by the United States Forest Service for use on their fuels monitoring plots. This sampling method was kept and repeated at both Winston 8 for species presence and absence, and the full method was conducted at Sandyland Sanctuary. The plot size is a 1/5 acre, so about 9,000 square feet. 3 transects radiate out from plot center in 120-degree intervals and are 52.7 feet long. All trees greater than 2 inches in diameter were measured to determine midstory and overstory stocking and species composition. Fuels were recorded using a modified version of the Brown method, which involves separating downwoody material out into size classes, which fall along particular intervals on each transect. Understory species presence and absence were measured within 3 2x5 foot rectangular subplots located to the right of each transect. The litter and duff depth, if present, was measured at 5, 15, 25, 35, and 45 feet along the left of each transect. These images do a good job at showing the typical conditions on a U.S. Forest Service site compared to the previous few pictures at Sandyland Sanctuary and Winston 8, the former having much greater densities of woody stems in the understory, midstory, and overstory. This 360-degree image shows what the average plot location looked like at Sandylands. The lower image is another 360-degree image showing the average composition of a plot on the National Forest. Here we see the resulting species diversity at each site. Note the low species diversity at the Upland Island Wilderness area. Here are the averages for the environmental variables studied at all site locations except Winston 8 Ranch. In Winston 8 Ranch, only canopy cover measurements were recorded. Before conducting further analysis, univariate normality was confirmed, and some variables required transformations. Those transformations are listed in the table. And following the confirmation of univariate normality, a multivariate normality test was conducted just to confirm normality. For our analysis, historical fire frequency has 3 categories, which were determined by site management histories, with Sandyland and Winston 8 representing a higher fire frequency, that is every 2 years, 2 to 3 years burn. The National Forest sites represented a medium fire frequency, which was greater than 3, less than 10, and the Upland Island Wilderness representing a low fire frequency, which was fewer than 1 burn in 10 years. The first analysis method used was non-metric multidimensional scaling, or NMDS for short. The NMDS figures are a useful visualization tool. However, they're not used to draw finite conclusions, and the axes are practically meaningless. However, they are great visualizations. The convex holes represent different site locations, and note how the dark blue E, which represents Sandyland, is uniquely separate from the other sites. Once we overlay the environmental variables, we can see that hardwood basal area and Site A, Upland Island Wilderness, are clustered. The litter depths in Site D, Angelina National Forest, are also together, and the ecological site and Sandyland are in the same spot. Following the NMDS, an exploratory MANOVA was run to narrow down the environmental variables which required further testing. Only variables meeting a significance of 0.1 or less were included for further analysis. Using one-way analysis of variance, followed by Tukey-Kramer post-hoc testing, it was determined that fuel loadings were significantly higher on moderate fire frequency sites at a 0.1 significance level. This determination is unusual, and we haven't determined why this particular result occurred. Litter depths were lowest on the high fire frequency sites, with low frequency sites averaging nearly an inch more litter. Canopy cover was significantly different across all groups of fire frequencies, and this is likely a result of management goals and history and not a direct result of the impact of fire frequencies. Hardwood basal areas were significantly higher on low fire frequency sites, and this is likely due to the suppressive effect that fire has on hardwood seedlings, reducing the number of stems greater than 2 inches included in the basal area measurements. Total basal area, like canopy cover, was significantly different across all groups of fire frequencies, and this was expected and is again likely management driven. Species diversity was significantly lower in the low fire frequency sites. Hardwood basal areas were found to be significantly higher at Upland Island when compared to the Angelina National Forest and Sandyland. It's also found that Sandyland had significantly lower hardwood basal areas when compared to the Davy Crockett National Forest. For species diversity and site groups, it was found that Sandyland had significantly higher diversity when compared to the Upland Island Wilderness and the Davy Crockett National Forest. It was also determined that the Sabine National Forest had a significantly higher diversity than Upland Island. The interaction between basal area and ecological site is driven by groups which included an ecological site that was found at Sandyland. The much lower than average basal area at Sandyland drove all the group pairs in which an ecological site found there was included to be significantly different. This, however, is almost certainly due to management factors and not natural differences between these ecological sites. To determine the true difference between ecological sites and forest structure, more investigation is needed and areas under less intensive management. To finish off the data analysis, Pearson correlation tests were run to determine the impacts of environmental variables on species diversity. It was determined that basal area and litter depth are inversely correlated to species diversity. This is, the larger the basal area or litter depth, and the lower the diversity on these sites. It's also determined that both hardwood and softwood basal area are inversely correlated as well. The comparative weakness in the hardwood basal area value is likely due to the moderate to low sampling of sites with the hardwood basal area even present. Findings that Sandyland and Upland Island Wilderness had significantly higher hardwood basal areas were expected. As seen in the photos above, each site has vastly different forest structures that are influenced by the historical management of each site. Sandyland experiencing a prescribed fire nearly every 2 years, and Upland Island only having a few fires in the past 3 decades. The correlations between these variables lead us to the conclusion that the reduction of fire in upland pine communities leads to an increase in basal area, primarily through the rise in hardwood stem establishment. This and the concomitant increase in litter depths due to the suppression of fires or the removal of fire leads to the suppression of understory forbs and grasses, which lowers the herbaceous species diversity in the understory of these communities. I'd like to take a moment to thank all those listed, as well as all those who assisted in the field with the collection of data. We gathered a rather large amount of data considering the state of the country over the past 2 years, and that would not have been possible without helpful crew members that were willing to take part. Thank you.